Coming up on UGTV. A special session of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas.
Stuff at that point and then come back at this point and refine our budget, kind of run through each thing that's in there and then refine it as to what comes out in the final budget in July, or at least the proposed budget in July. I will say we're having a little bit of a snafu in getting our final presentation loaded up. Commissioner McKernan, I believe, do you have it there? So the electronic has been sent out to all the commissioners, though they haven't. It was a large file, so when we went to send it down here, it didn't make it, and not sure how it worked that way for you, but I'm glad it worked out from Rocky, but we don't have it loaded on the computer down here yet to pull up. So we'll have it momentarily, so we can have it up and move through it, and then correspondingly, I'll probably have all the copies of it, which we'll probably distribute to you after we come back up from the graduation. A couple of things I want to go through and talk about before I turn this over to finance to start going through. We're just going through the project work tonight. I'm not presenting the capital equipment. It's project work, which is usually the emphasis where we get into, I think, from the equipment standpoint. Previous years, you've all kind of left that more to figure out how to budget it and let us know what we're coming up with the purchase in terms of equipment, how we'll operate the fleet. So we'll be focusing on that. Cash over debt is really a primary emphasis that we're trying to do again this year. You know, what we could move to cash versus what was in debt previously. Though we still have a significant amount of debt in this. Excuse me. First part of the presentation, we're going to talk about, again, a little bit from where we were in the last retreat, where we talked about some of the debt. So I want to go back over just where this proposed budget at this time will lead us to if we keep on track from a debt standpoint, and then move from that standpoint. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Debbie Johnsher, and she's going to start moving through the presentation. Debbie?
Good evening. I'll go ahead and just go through the slides that we had. First couple of slides, I was just going to do a kind of a recap of the CMIP. It's a presentation I've done the last several years. Just kind of tells us what's in the CMIP. So the Capital Maintenance Improvement Program is a 5-year plan for capital projects and improvement and equipment needs. Improvements can be reconstruction, rehabilitation, or maintenance of an asset. And equipment needs can usually be upgrade, it can be the purchase of new equipment or upgrades to existing equipment. All capital improvements are financed in one of two ways, either pay-as-you-go with cash or as long-term financing. Usually equipment is financed as a lease purchase, and it's usually done over 3 to 10 years. And the larger capital improvements are financed with long-term bonds, usually 15 to 20 years. Under, I'll just kind of talk about some of the things that are included for capital equipment. We've got vehicles, which usually includes patrol cars for police, fire, and sheriff. We've got ambulances and other fleet vehicles. Large equipment would include tractors and mowers and street sweepers, the larger equipment. And I believe that I'm on slide 3 now. You're getting a copy. Okay. And then technology equipment could be either computer or software upgrades. Is it coming on the computer? Nope. Okay. Okay. Capital projects, we have public buildings, which would be any of our public buildings, the courthouse and city hall, as well as any of our other buildings. Infrastructure usually includes streets, bridges, curbs and sidewalks, as well as sewers, stormwater, things like that. Parking lots, parks and recreation, and can include playground equipment. It can include maintenance to shelters. We also have traffic control, which includes traffic signals and lighting. The next slide just kind of goes through the process for putting the CMIP together. Usually requests are submitted to either the Finance Department or the Public Works Department. I've listed on the slide several of the meetings that we've had over the last couple of years that show the different meetings that we've had. Public Works has been to the Standing Committee back in October and November to talk about a lot of the upcoming projects. And a little bit later in the presentation, they're going to go into more detail on some of those projects. Over the last few weeks, we've been having an administrative review with several departments and administration just to review all of the capital that's been submitted and determining what we're planning to put into the CMIP. Now we're at the commission review, which is when we present the CMIP to the commission and give you the chance to look at what's in there and give us feedback. Once this is finalized, then the capital budget would be submitted along with the operating budget and approved during the budget process. This next slide just shows our CMIP projects. This includes both cash and debt projects, and we separated them out for cash, and then we've split out county debt and city debt. So as you can see, each year are the different levels of debt that we've issued. Back in 2010, we issued quite a bit of debt. We had stimulus bonds that were available. Typically, we finance our debt projects with temporary notes until the construction is done, and then we move to permanent financing. In 2010, we actually bonded several projects to take advantage of those stimulus bonds. So that increased the amount of debt that we funded in 2010. Maybe just to clarify, the blue line is the city debt. The brown line is the county debt, and then the gray is the cash. So as you can see in 2018, we have a significant amount of debt showing on the county side, and that would include some of the improvements to the adult jail facility as well as the juvenile facility.
And just to make note of that, I mean, that's a $20 million project just on itself on the juvenile side, and then we add to it the other, if you remember, we had to go through and make a lot of modifications over finishing the roof project, finishing, various HVAC projects such within the adult jail facility in order to make that a reality. So big jump up on that one section of it, but that's also one we're factoring for as we come to the future slides.
The next two slides are the same slides that you saw, actually 4 slides, that you saw 2 weeks ago in the strategic planning session. We went over the debt levels for the city and county. So this is just to recap, this is the city debt showing the debt payments that are already obligated. So we finance these projects and they're in permanent financing. The dotted line that you see going up is where we have assumed an increase to the assessed valuation of 1.9% each year going forward. So then the next layer shows where we went in and we assumed that we were going to bond $15 million in general obligation debt each year all the way out through 2037. So this graph is the same as what you saw 2 weeks ago. We didn't build it. We had talked about whether we should have built some inflation in, but we went ahead and decided to keep the $15 million because that's where we had talked about where we think we want it. We don't want to increase debt. So getting into the outer years, if we're issuing the same amount of debt that we're issuing now, the assumption is that we would be paying for fewer projects with debt. So the next graph is the county debt. This one shows the bond payments that are already obligated and with the same assumption. And both of these graphs also assume no change in the mill rate. And so this builds on the improvements to the adult jail and the juvenile facility out into the future. This next debt shows our legal debt limit. We thought we would just touch on this to show where we've been over the last several years. Up at the top, we've got the calculation that we did earlier this year showing our debt margin. So we start with a legal debt limit of $394 million, and that's calculated based on 30% of our current assessed value. And then we subtract out our outstanding debt, and that leaves us a margin of how much debt we can continue to issue in the future. These percentages just show over the past 10 years, where our legal debt limit has been. And as you can see, back in 2006 and 2007, our debt limit was fairly low. Our margin was fairly high. So, but as we went into the recession and we started issuing more debt and less cash funding of projects, that number started to increase. Usually when we finance a project, it's in the temp note stage for 2 to 3 years. So that number just continued to increase as we started financing projects in 2008 to 2011. So and now for 2016, we're at 72%. So this next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen Von Atchen.
So last February, we made credit rating presentations to both Moody's and S&P as part of our annual general obligation debt financing. So we were doing those presentations in order to issue the debt for the current fiscal year's projects, right? And at that time, based on the information we provided them, they ended up affirming or agreeing with keeping the same credit rating that we had originally. So they didn't make any changes. And so those were the GO issuer rating was affirmed at AA minus with a stable outlook, and by Moody's it was A1 stable outlook. When they say stable outlook, what they mean is that they don't expect any kind of change up or down in the rating in the next 2 years. And that, when we give the presentation, we give them some out-year forecasts, and so that's what they base that information on. Now, when they do their analysis, they go through and they have basically 5 or 6, depending on which firm you're talking to, 5 or 6 factors. And so overall, based on the 2 firms, the unified government scored very strong or strong, in the areas of management and liquidity, which liquidity is whether we have sufficient cash to meet our obligations on an ongoing basis throughout the year. Budgetary performance, which budgetary performance speaks to whether we are consistently, for the most part, meeting revenues with expenditures. If our operational performance is consistent with our revenue performance. And then institutional framework, which really has to do with, they review all our financial policies and we make sure that whether we're complying with them, but the fact that we have financial policies, also it also goes to a little bit into what kind of revenue restrictions the state law mandates on our local governments in Kansas. So in all those areas, we scored very strong. The areas where there's a need to have some focus in the future are these three other areas, and that's the economic factor, the debt factor, and the budgetary flexibility factor. So a couple of these factors, it's very difficult to move the needle because it takes many years and a lot of effort to change some of these factors. The last one is the one where we have most flexibility. So on the economy, what they do is they measure the effective buying income as a percentage of the U.S. average. And so according to Moody's and Standard & Poor's, the average would be 85 to 100% of the U.S. average. And the unified government is at 62. The second factor, or the second item in the economic factor is a market value per capita. And they view an adequate performance in this factor at 80,000 to 100,000, and we're at 54,000. So this is something that we're continually working on, as you know, all the many economic development efforts that have taken place over the various 10 or 20 years have helped us in these areas, but all we can do really is continue to forge forward with making these improvements. The second one is that debt factor, and what they look at is the net direct debt as a percentage of total governmental revenues. They find that an average or an adequate percentage is 60 to 120, and we're at 220. So we really do need to consider that it's very important to keep our debt at moderate levels and not continue to increase it, because we're already at a very high margin right now. And then the very last area is budgetary flexibility. So that is the general fund reserve that we often talk about. And so they're looking at how much of the reserve is as a percentage of the total general fund expenditures. And they view that it's adequate, given our size, to have one between 4 and 8%. But in 2015, that percentage was 17%. And that is partly because of the sale of the Cerner property, which we subsequently utilized those revenues or that source of money in the subsequent year. So the fact that we had a very healthy percentage in this category helped us sustain the credit rating that we currently hold. But if we were to continue to drop the percentage down, any lower than 10% into the future, into 16 or 17, then the credit rating that we have right now could very well be at risk. It's vulnerable. And so we hope that as we do our budget planning, I hope that we keep all of this in mind. So.
Okay, that kind of takes us through the first part of the presentation of just kind of putting us in position. The next stage we have, so this is really probably a pretty good breaking point. If there are any questions about this first part, when we come back, we'll get into the projects, and we'll have we walk through the high level of the changes that are made to them, and we'll have the copies of all the debt and the cash projects. You'll have those in front of you too at that time, but the emphasis is we'll walk through the ones we have. Yes, Commissioner?
On the percent of legal debt limit slide.
Can you turn your microphone on?
Yes, I can. On the percent of legal debt limit slide from 2011 to 12,
I'm just curious if there's something we can point to that jumped it between those 2 years, or in the year
Well, it would probably be an
2020.
amount of debt issued back in 9 or 10. I mean, because as Debbie said, remember, it's the amount of issuance, and then it's the amount that we put into temp bonds. So you can be consistent in your level of temp notes that you take out each year, but then in 2011, probably, we finished up a lot of projects, and then that caused us to roll those into bonds.
So in essence, we're well under our legal debt margin, but higher than the bonding ratings would like us to see. Is that right?
Well, they have an adequate, strong or very strong, then they have weak or very weak. And right now, our debt level is very weak.
Okay.
That's how they're ranking it.
So we're well within the legal requirements, but need to improve for
Yes.
our adequacy in terms of our,
That's right.
Bond
So
rating.
what's the harm of getting, if we were to get downgraded, what would happen is, in the future, we'd issue debt at roughly 0.25% more in interest rate than what we're paying now. And so on a let's say a $20 million bond issue over 20 years, that would cost us around an extra $1 million a year. Or so, no, over the 20 years, so I'm sorry. So it's about $1 million over the 20-year period. And so that's what it is.
thank you. All right, any other questions before we head downstairs for the sheriff's graduation? All right, we're going to be in recess. We're going to go downstairs for sheriff's graduation. That will be on UGTV, and then we'll come back up to complete our program tonight.